I'm very excited to talk to you today, Andrew. You are a rising star in the field for mathematics of consciousness science. And to me, that's no wonder. And that's because I'm no philosopher. I know very little about philosophy, but I watched your talks that are already on YouTube and I was able to understand them. And they made a lot of sense to me. So I will link below the links to those talks that got me so excited. And what really stuck out to me with your work is the rigor that goes into your thinking and that even translates into how you present your thoughts and the clarity with which you present and what drives your thinking. And this seems like such a welcome thing in the fields of consciousness that for a lot of people seems to be characterized by the opposite, by some kind of fluffiness. And so this kind of rigor and clarity, I think, is sorely needed. And I got quite excited at one of your last talks when you believe that real progress can be made by formalizing things about the structure of consciousness and phenomenal experience. So I'm very excited to hear about that today from you.
Thank you, Alex. I mean, that's really nice for me to hear. And yeah, I'm glad that the aim that I bring in my work is to have clarity and precision. So I'm glad that's coming through.
Can you tell me how you got into this mess? What got you interested in consciousness, and also your academic vita that got you to this point and what you're doing right now?
Yeah. So I guess it started for me when I was 16 and still in high school. And at that time, I was a fairly good student, but I wasn't really inspired by any academic subjects. I did fine in my classes, but I wasn't really that interested in anything. But then there were two things that really changed that for me. So one was reading Gödel, Escher, Bach by Douglas Hofstadter. And the second was reading David Chalmers on philosophical zombies and the hard problem of consciousness. Those two texts were really transformative for me. And I guess after that, I just became fascinated by consciousness. And I was really gripped by the fact that each of us is intimately acquainted with our own conscious experiences, but it still was this phenomenon that remained little understood. It was still one of these remaining great mysteries about the natural world. So in that respect, I guess consciousness was the first thing that really sparked my academic interests, and that spark has never really fully left me. Also, I really liked the purity and generality of analytic philosophy. And I went into college wanting to study philosophy and consciousness in particular. And I was pretty lucky in my undergrad experience. So I went to Brown University, and there happened to be this community of undergrads that were there at the same time that were also into philosophy. And a bunch of us were into philosophy of mind. So we had this department undergraduate group where we met every couple of weeks and talked about different philosophical topics. And I felt like I was really able to benefit from just having lots of conversations with peers, even when I was in undergrad. And I mean, my interest in consciousness kind of stuck with me throughout the whole of college. And I eventually decided to apply to grad school and to try to become a philosopher of consciousness. And I was lucky enough to get into NYU for my PhD, where I was able to work with David Chalmers, as well as Ned Block and Thomas Nagel, all of whom were some of my intellectual heroes. And I mean, so it's pretty common for people's interests to change during the course of grad school, but consciousness never really left me. And I mean, nowadays, I do work on a number of philosophical issues outside of consciousness. I've tainted my pure record, but consciousness has always been at the heart of my philosophical interests, and the structure of consciousness in particular, that's at the heart of my interest in consciousness.
Yeah, and what got you? That is such an interesting thing, because it seems that different people from different parts of the planet at the same time started thinking along those lines. So what was it about structure that got you the most interest about consciousness?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So to start, I guess I've just long thought that these sorts of questions about the structure of consciousness, are both really interesting, but also really underexplored. And I think maybe one reason for why they're underexplored is that there are many people, including myself, who have been kind of seduced by classic philosophical questions about the fundamental nature of consciousness. Like the hard problem, philosophical zombies, Mary's room, all that stuff. And I think that's great. I mean, I care a lot about those sorts of questions, and I think they're important questions. But I also think that consciousness research, and especially the philosophy of consciousness, has been overly dominated by those sorts of questions. There's so many interesting theoretical questions about consciousness that go beyond the hard problem, including questions about the structure of consciousness. And I think some people might have the impression that philosophy of consciousness is just about those questions about the fundamental nature, but I think there's a whole lot more there. And that's part of what I'm trying to develop and investigate and uncover in my own research. Now, I guess one thing is that, at the same time, investigating the structure of consciousness is really hard. And maybe that's part of why these questions are underexplored as well. It's oftentimes not obvious how to make progress. Mm-hmm. And if you introspect your own conscious experience right now, mm-hmm. you'll find that it's obvious that it's richly structured, but how exactly to think about that structure, what kinds of models or tools we should use for characterizing that structure, those are really difficult questions. Mm-hmm. But I think these are also super important questions, and the kinds of questions that we'll need to tackle in order to really make progress in consciousness research. Mm-hmm. And in fact, if you look at other sciences, physics, biology, psychology, whatever, in general, as a scientific field develops, it starts to move away from essence questions or questions about the fundamental nature of the entity studied, and instead to structural questions or questions about how the entities of the domain are related to each other, how to model those relations. And right now, consciousness research is still dominated by a focus on essence questions. The biggest question in the philosophy of consciousness is, what is the fundamental nature of consciousness? And the biggest question in the science of consciousness is, what physical properties make a system conscious versus not? Mm. But I suspect that if you look at consciousness research a century from now, if we were able to do that somehow, we would see a much greater focus on structural questions.
Mm. It's very interesting because often with that development in science has also been the formalization and mathematization. And that is also something that you and other people that are interested in the structure have been championing as well. And so there's an analog there that often leads to progress as well, because you're leaving behind the woolly words, you're boiling it down to something that is much more rigorous. So I'm curious what led you into that direction to use formal tools and combine that with your interest in the structure of consciousness.
I guess part of what led me in that direction is basically just agreement with the thought that you were expressing, that one of the best ways of sharpening and systematizing our inquiry into a phenomenon is to figure out how to use mathematical tools for modeling it or understanding it. And as I said, I think that's really hard in the case of consciousness, but I think that quality spaces, which we'll talk about more later, that's one of the ways in to start doing that in the case of consciousness. I guess also maybe this is another way of expressing why I was motivated and gravitated towards this kind of topic. So there's this famous passage at the end of Thomas Nagel's What Is It Like to Be a Bat, where he says, investigating consciousness is really hard, but maybe it would be more tractable if we could somehow develop an objective phenomenology or a way of understanding conscious experiences that doesn't require one to have had the experiences under question. And this passage is really well known, but most people react to it with the thought that, well, that sounds cool, but what would this look like? It's not clear what an objective phenomenology would be or whether that's even coherent or makes sense. So one of my most recent publications is entitled Objective Phenomenology and argues that it is indeed possible to develop an objective phenomenology, and that the way of doing so is to investigate the structure of consciousness. So basically, my view is that purely structural facts about consciousness, for example, the kinds of facts captured by mathematical models, those are objective phenomenal facts. And that's a way of doing objective phenomenology. And the paper I mentioned of mine was published just last year, but the basic ideas behind it have been a guiding thought and guiding motivation behind my work for a number of years. So I think that's another way of explaining or justifying why a focus on the structure of consciousness, and in particular on figuring out ways to mathematically model different aspects of consciousness experiences, is interesting and promising, and maybe will help pave the way towards progress in consciousness research.
But this might come a little bit out of the left wing maybe, but there's something deeper, almost mysterious in the fact that if you really boil down science and you really think about all of this, it's almost like mathematics is all there is. I don't know, you can go as extreme as Max Tegmark maybe to really say that it's almost ontological in nature, but isn't it what you said really rings so true in my thinking as well, that when science is at its best, it just comes up with a bunch of equations. And so it seems so exciting that we might have reached that point in consciousness research that we can use the same language. And so when Galileo Galilei said the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, that we now reached a chapter where it comes to consciousness. And we can start maybe reading it in the same language. So that seems very exciting, at the same time mysterious maybe, that this works.
Yeah, well, so a couple thoughts there. One is that I think we're still pretty far off from actually being able to do that with consciousness, just because I think we're still very much in the early stages of inquiring about consciousness and figuring it out. So one analogy I like to make is that we're sort of in this pre-Newtonian stage in investigating consciousness, a stage analogous to pre-Newton and investigating the physical world, where part of what we're trying to do is figure out the basic insights that will enable systematic mathematical theories in the future. And, it's really hard to break past that basic stage. That's part of why, like, Newtonian physics was so remarkable. So I guess in my mind, we're very much at the early stages, and maybe we're on the cusp of developing more sophisticated mathematical models, but I think there's still a lot of work in just figuring out how do we think about the structure of consciousness in the first place, and then what kinds of formalisms will be useful for thinking about that. But then to return to the first part of what you were saying, so one line of thought you might have about the physical world is some people are sympathetic to a kind of Pythagoreanism, where everything is just math. There's nothing more to the world than just mathematical structures. And similarly, you might take a similar attitude towards consciousness. Maybe consciousness is just more math. There's not all of this like intrinsic qualia stuff. It's just mathematical structures. And I'm somebody who's very pro investigating the structure of consciousness, but I'm also somebody who thinks that there's more to consciousness than just structure. I think that investigating the structure of consciousness will tell us a whole lot about consciousness. It'll give us these frameworks for thinking about it more systematically, but it's not going to capture everything. And I think part of what is, in fact, remarkable about consciousness and interesting about it is that it's a phenomenon that consists of more than just structure. And even if we developed the best mathematical models we possibly could, I think that they would still be leaving something out. They wouldn't be inadequate. They might capture all of the structural aspects of consciousness. But I'm somebody who thinks that there's qualia in the most robust, real sense that you might think.
Now, if I may push on that a little bit, then what do you think of this idea that maybe when it comes to science, though, that what science can explain might then maybe be limited to the structure, maybe when it comes to the whole world and consciousness. So in other words, so maybe it is true that there are things that are, hard problem, that they're beyond science's reach, but at least now we have something here that we can pull on and become more scientific about it. And it has this promise that it falls into the fold of mathematical understanding of the world as we have in physics and other disciplines.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting idea. And I'm not sure what my own view on that is yet. So that's partly because I think that it's kind of up for grabs what we think of as the nature of the science of consciousness and the scope of scientific investigation in general. I guess I'm somebody who's fairly sympathetic to the general thought that scientific investigation aims to tell us about the structure of the world. But you might think that in the case of consciousness, there's an exception. There's a different kind of epistemic relationship that we bear to our own conscious experiences than that we bear to the external world. We're in direct contact with our own conscious experiences in a way that we're not in direct contact with the external world. And because of that, we're able to acquire knowledge not just of the structure of the domain under investigation, but also its intrinsic nature. I guess I do think that everything I just said is true, but the thing that I feel unsure about is how should we think about the scope of the science of consciousness? Is it the case that in acquiring knowledge of and investigating the qualitative character of our experiences, is that within the purview of the science of consciousness, or is it not? And I mean, in some ways, I think this is, but you might think, for example, scientific investigation by nature has to produce public knowledge, and we can't have public knowledge of the qualities of one's own experiences. That's something that is essentially private. So anyway, I guess my thought is that there's an interesting question here that concerns both how we should think about the scope of investigation into consciousness, but also just how we should think about the nature of science in general.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's very interesting. If I can push you on the more crazy things, so you brought up Newton, right? And so there's an interesting piece of history there that maybe we can learn from. And so my understanding is that it was quite important for him that he basically the way discovered or invented calculus to then make progress in physics. And so the question that I have is, do you think that we might also have to work on the mathematics side of things, and maybe that will help us allow more breakthroughs in the science of consciousness?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question too. I guess I don't see any positive reason for thinking that as of now. It seems to me that the difficulties with figuring out how to mathematically model our conscious experiences don't lie on the side of, oh, we need more sophisticated or just novel mathematical frameworks or formalisms, but instead that it's just really not obvious how to think about the target of inquiry that we're trying to develop mathematical models of. So, I mean, in the case of quality spaces, it's not like the mathematical structures that we need to appeal to are particularly new or novel or anything. They're like geometric spaces and things that are fairly familiar. Maybe it's the case that there will be certain aspects of conscious experiences where we just don't have anything in our current mathematical repertoire that adequately captures that structure. But I guess in the absence of a compelling example, I'm inclined to think that the default is to just assume that, well, the difficulty just lies on getting a better qualitative understanding of the domain under consideration rather than on the tools that we have for modeling that domain.
Yeah, that's convincing. So maybe this might be a good point to lead into what you prepared. We might have whetted everybody's appetite on how can this be done, to talk more formally about the structure of consciousness and quality of spaces.
Okay, so I prepared a brief presentation of the ideas in one of my articles, Modeling Mental Qualities, that was published, well, I guess not last year, 2 years ago now, in the Journal of Philosophical Review. And I'm going to just provide a pretty brief overview of the core ideas from this article and mention a few of the interesting questions or applications that arise from the framework that I develop. So I'll keep it pretty short and compact. So the central question that I'm interested in here is, how do we model the qualities of conscious experiences, qualities like those involved in seeing red or feeling pain, smelling cinnamon? And my article is arguing that the standard approach for modeling these mental qualities is inadequate, that it can't capture a certain core feature of our conscious experiences. And then I develop a new framework that's more powerful and flexible and showcase some of the applications of the framework. So maybe to start, let me introduce the concept of a quality space model. This is probably familiar to many audience members, even if not by that name. So a quality space model in general is a model of some domain of qualities, for example, colors, sounds, smells. And The most famous example is the three-dimensional model of color experiences that has hue, saturation, and brightness as dimensions. But there are quality space models, or at least potentially could be quality space models for just about any domain of qualities, auditory, olfactory, and so forth. So these models are pretty remarkable for people interested in consciousness. And in fact, I think this is a very underexplored aspect of consciousness research. And one reason is that quality space models are one of the few cases where we actually have systematic models of some aspect of conscious experiences, and where we know pretty well how to conduct empirical investigation and to develop mathematical formalisms. Another reason is that quality space models are super general. Any domain of mental qualities is going to be structured by similarity relations. And as soon as we have similarity, we can model that domain of qualities using a geometric space. So if part of our goal is to map out the structures of conscious experiences, then a significant part of that project is probably going to be consistent developing quality space models for different domains of experiences. Okay, so one very quick terminological note. I'm using the term mental qualities here and also in the article, but I'm treating that as synonymous with terms like phenomenal qualities or qualia. So the standard approach to quality space models, what I'll call the standard framework, models mental qualities via points in geometrical spaces, where the distances between points correspond to degrees of phenomenal similarity. And you can kind of see this representation of the three-dimensional model for color experiences in this picture here. And the standard framework, it works pretty well. But one aspect of conscious experiences that it doesn't really work so well for is what I call phenomenal precision. So to get a grip on precision, think about the contrast between your foveal color experience of something as scarlet versus your peripheral color experience of something as red. So your foveal color experience is more precise than your peripheral color experience. And precision, in the sense that I'm using the term, denotes a certain phenomenal property, a certain property of your experiences, namely the property that contrasts your foveal color experience from your peripheral color experience. Precision isn't just specific to color experience, though. So think about, for example, the phenomenal contrast between, say, hearing a sound that's muffled versus a sound that's clear, or touching a surface with your fingertips versus with your back. Those also plausibly involve contrasts in precision. So there's this feature of phenomenology that, is just an aspect of our conscious experiences. And the standard framework has kind of an awkward time capturing precision. And that's because the standard framework models mental qualities via points, but imprecise qualities correspond to regions rather than points. At least that's a very natural way of thinking about precision. There's more that I say in the paper to motivate this appeal to regions. For example, some people think, well, couldn't we just add an extra dimension for precision? And that would be one possibility, but I think that for various reasons, that isn't the most appealing possibility for capturing precision. So a very natural move when we start thinking about precision and quality space models is to move from modeling mental qualities using points to using regions. And that's the move that I make in my paper. So it's a pretty basic idea: represent mental qualities via regions, meaning sets of points instead of individual points. But part of what I argue is that this pretty simple move is much more powerful and interesting than you might initially think. And it enables rich new investigation into consciousness that's at the intersection of philosophy and cog-sci and math. So there's a few constraints that we want on our models if we are doing things in terms of regions rather than points. So first and foremost, we want sizes of regions to correspond to degrees of precision. So the introduction of regions is intended to provide a way of capturing precision. So experiences that are more imprecise will correspond to bigger regions. And then we want one-to-one correspondence between what I'll call permissible regions, or regions that actually represent genuine possible mental qualities, and the qualities themselves. We want distance to inversely correspond to phenomenal similarity, and we want phenomenal identity when two qualities are indistinguishable to correspond to distance 0 to occupy exactly the same location in the space. So in the paper itself, I go through different elements of the regional framework, and I explain how to think about them and the associated philosophical issues that arise. I'm not going to talk about that stuff. Instead, all I'm going to do here is I'm just going to mention a few interesting questions that arise when we start thinking in terms of the regional framework, and also some of the applications that arise when we move to the regional framework. So here's one interesting question. We could ask, what kinds of regions actually represent possible qualities? So a region, in my definition, is just any set of points. And for any quality space model, there's going to be all sorts of weirdly structured sets of points where it's not obvious whether that set corresponds to a real phenomenal possibility. So for example, you might wonder whether there could be experiences that correspond to disconnected regions. Could you have a color experience that represents something either as aquamarine or scarlet, but no shades in between? You might wonder, what would that kind of experience be like? Is such an experience possible? And those are philosophical and empirical questions, but what the regional framework enables us to do is to translate these into a more precise mathematical language that allows us to ask these questions in a more precise way. And interestingly, it also makes it the case that different theories about the space and structure of possible mental qualities will correspond to different formal constraints on the set of permissible regions. So one thing to notice here is how the regional framework enables us to start theorizing about the qualities of consciousness experiences more systematically. It would be difficult to even formulate these questions in the first place without the use of this framework. So I think that provides a glimpse of how the regional framework enables us to address theoretical and empirical questions with greater precision and to raise new questions that we previously lacked the conceptual tools to think about. That's one new interesting question that arises when we move to the regional framework. Another interesting question concerns the metric. So there's all sorts of ways of constructing a metric, meaning a distance function on regions, assuming that we already have a well-defined notion of distance between points. So for example, one of the most commonly used metrics on regions is the least distance metric, where the distance between two regions is the distance between their closest points. Another common metric is the average distance metric, where the distance between two regions is the average distance between all their points. And if we're seeking a metric that models phenomenal similarity, then we're going to need that metric to satisfy certain kinds of formal constraints. So for example, we want every region to have distance 0 to itself, since distance 0 represents maximal similarity, meaning phenomenal identity. So once we identify these formal constraints, it's a pretty substantive and interesting question of figuring out which kind of metric on regions actually is the right one for modeling phenomenal similarity. And one thing I argue in my article is that neither the least distance metric nor the average distance metric work. They systematically make incorrect predictions. So instead, I propose a new metric that I think generates the right kinds of results, which I call the qualitative similarity metric, or the qual metric. This is the formal statement of the metric where A and B are two regions. And I'm not going to explain how exactly the metric works, but to give you some intuition, you can basically think of it as a more sophisticated version of an average distance metric. So the average distance metric works pretty well most of the time, but it turns out to lead to systematically incorrect results for phenomenal similarity when we have cases involving overlapping regions. So for example, the average distance metric yields the absurd result that every mental quality is less than maximally similar to itself. And that's because if you take the average distance from a region to itself, you'll get a non-zero value. So my qual metric doesn't generate these sorts of absurd consequences, but still yields results that otherwise resemble average distance. And more generally, it yields the right kinds of predictions across all the kinds of relationships that two regions can bear to each other. So that's one thing that's kind of cool. We get this more interesting, sophisticated formalism for capturing phenomenal similarity. Also, I think one thing that's cool that comes out of the regional framework is that there are multiple dimensions of phenomenal similarity, and we can formally disentangle those dimensions. So alongside qualitative similarity measured by the qual metric, there's also precision similarity, similarity with respect to how precise two experiences are, which is measured by a precision similarity metric. So, for example, think about a foveal experience of red and a foveal experience of green versus a peripheral experience of red. The two foveal experiences are similar in a certain respect to each other, in which they aren't to the peripheral experience. So precision similarity, on the way that I'm defining the metric, is measured by the ratio between the smaller region to the larger region. And again, there's a lot more that's said in the paper to walk through the metric and to motivate it. But stepping back, thinking about the big picture, I think what's interesting here is that this is one case where I think formalization can actually help with understanding the phenomenology. So what the regional framework enables us to do is to pull apart two distinct dimensions of phenomenal similarity and seeing how they fall out of the formal structure of the regional framework. This gives us a much more precise and systematic understanding of phenomenal similarity than we would otherwise have. Last thing I'll mention as an interesting application of the regional framework concerns the phenomenal serieties. So a phenomenal serieties is a case where a subject cannot discriminate an object alpha from an object beta or beta from gamma, but can discriminate alpha from gamma. So for example, imagine that you're in a psychophysics experiment and you're seeing 3 color chips, each of which is a different shade of gray. And you can discriminate the first from the third, but you can't discriminate the first from the second or the second from the third. So if I tried to actually construct a phenomenal serieties case here, if I did it aptly, then you will be able to discriminate the shade of gray of this first circle, alpha, from that of gamma, but not any of the pairwise circles. So alpha and beta might look to be the same shade of gray, and beta and gamma might look to be the same shade of gray. Okay, so that's the phenomenon. That's a phenomenon that's well known. There's been a lot written about it. It's a phenomenon that calls out for explanation. You might wonder what exactly is going on phenomenologically in phenomenal serieties cases. And the idea that I had is that we can apply the regional framework to the phenomenal serieties where the probability of a phenomenal serieties occurring, I hypothesize, corresponds to the overlap structure of the relevant regions. So in other words, the more A and B overlap, or the more B and C overlap, the more likely it is that the subject will not be able to discriminate the color of alpha from beta or beta from gamma. And the less A and C overlap, the more likely it is that they'll be able to discriminate the color of alpha from gamma. So that's the basic idea. So that yields this probabilistic model of the phenomenal serieties that comes out of the regional framework. I'm not going to fully explain all this. That would require a bit too much time on technical issues. But here's the basic idea. The regional framework gives us this probabilistic model of how likely it is that a phenomenal serieties occurs, where the input to the model is the regions that represent the subject's experiences, and in particular, the overlap structure between those regions. And the thought is that a phenomenal serieties is more likely to occur when A and B overlap more, or B and C overlap more, or when A and C overlap less. Okay. So one exciting thing about this application in particular is that it has the potential to inform future empirical investigation into consciousness. But I won't talk about that more for limits of time. So here's just a summary of what I've been talking about in this brief overview. So the goal of this article of mine is to develop a new framework for quality space models where the core idea is to represent qualities using regions, and where size of region inversely corresponds to degree of precision. And the regional framework enables us to ask a bunch of interesting new questions about phenomenology. For example, which kinds of regions represent possible mental qualities? How do we construct the right similarity metrics? And it also has a number of applications, for example, the probabilistic model of the phenomenal serieties, as well as a number of other things. And there's an article link at the bottom if you're interested in taking a look at the details. I wanted to end with a more general thought. So I'm interested generally in philosophical questions about the structure of consciousness. And I have listed here some of the questions that I think are especially interesting or important for making progress. These are mostly fairly foundational questions, but I think they're questions that we ought to explore to get a better understanding of this topic. And in fact, all these questions are underexplored. There's not yet much work in philosophy or the science of consciousness on these sorts of questions. But I think this is also changing. In recent years, there's been more and more attention being paid to the structure of consciousness. And I think this is exciting, and I'm interested in seeing how things continue to develop in the future.
Yeah, very cool. I have so many questions and ideas coming out of all of this. This is, by the way, this is also really great. This is very inspiring about these open questions. And I almost feel like I would like to put a poll below in the video what viewers might be most interested in and get you back on to talk about one of these topics. Because each of these are really interesting questions.
Well, these, maybe it's worth mentioning that these first 4 questions I have written on or am currently writing on. The last 4 questions I'm interested in and I have thoughts about, but for me, they're questions for future work. So I've in my research program, I've been slowly trying to progress through this host of questions.
Okay, great. I mean, so when it comes to the regions idea that you bring in, it seems to me as one of these things that you go in hindsight, everybody should go duh, because this whole idea that your qualia would be a point in some kind of space seems questionable in the first place, right? Because a point, in a way, as a mathematical object, is infinitely small, and it comes with all kinds of problems. But when people show color spaces, they never show these points. they already show you regions, right? And so you're kind of duped into thinking, you're not thinking as a discretized kind of point space. So that's really interesting. I also found it interesting that you got the objection. It sounded like that some people said, well, why not solve that by adding another dimension? And so when it comes to the color space, at least, it sounds to me that your idea, and that's actually key, is that, let's say, your peripheral quality of scarlet is less precise, but if it's a region in color space, then that means that it can't be arbitrarily imprecise. The neighboring colors in that space, they determine that impreciseness, because that is where the imprecision can go to, right? If you just add another dimension, then the imprecision can be something other than that. This redness that you don't see it as precise as something at the fovea, if you think of that as spreading, being more wide or more fuzzy in color space, well, that means that it has something to do with which other colors are nearby.
Yeah, or I see. So at least if you're thinking that connectedness or maybe convexity is a constraint on the relevant regions, if I'm understanding your question. If you didn't require connectedness, then it doesn't really matter which other colors are nearby, because you could have, some very weirdly shaped regions. So but I think that's just an interesting open question, and we don't really know the answer to this.
Yeah, so intuitively, I just assumed that it must be connected, and there might, but it almost seems to me like an empirical question that we might be able to answer, right? Because you could show different kinds of shades of red, and you could basically explore the color space that's all around that redness. You can do that at the fovea, and you can do it in the periphery, and basically, if you can show more shades of red that are all around this color space, it's almost like you could map that region that you're talking about.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the ways in which the regional framework that I developed lends itself to empirical investigation, because there's going to be different kinds of predictions depending on, for example, what the structure of a given region is. As far as whether it's an empirical question, whether the regions for a quality space have to be connected or not, I think there's one question that's empirical, which is, how should we be thinking about the regions for human color experiences? How should we be thinking about, more generally, just the model of human color experiences? But then there's also a more general question: how do we think about the space of all possible experiences, where maybe it's the case that humans just have a certain kind of cognitive architecture that only enables certain kinds of possible color experiences? And that wouldn't be surprising if it were the case. Like, maybe there's not really much advantage to representing something as correspond in the way that like a disconnected region would. So there's also this more general metaphysical question of what kinds of experiences are possible in general, independent of how human color experiences happen to be. And that's a difficult question. I'm not sure, I'm not sure what considerations would bear either way on that question, but I think one cool thing is that now we can actually formulate this question and wonder about it at least.
Yeah, I don't know if you know, but there are some human tetrachromats. So they have 4 color receptors, and so that their color gamut should be wider. And as far as I know, there's very little work on that actually.
So this also goes to, I think, some very underexplored and very interesting questions about quality spaces. So there's tetrachromats, there's also colorblind people, and then there's also just other creatures that seem like they might have color experiences, but perhaps with a different dimensionality.
Right.
And there's an interesting question of how to think about the relations between these different quality spaces. For example, should we think that all possible color experiences, those for neurotypical humans and colorblind humans and dogs and mantis shrimp, are they all embedded in this bigger quality space that captures all possible color experiences? Or should we think about the relations between these different qualities of the same experiential domain, but of different spaces in a different way? I mean, this is something that I'm interested in thinking about more in the future. I have some very speculative thoughts at the moment on this, but I think that's an exciting topic to investigate.
There's also, I don't know if you ever heard about this, but our lens is actually filtering. It's basically a low pass filter. And so some people, they lose their lens and they get just a glass replacement that doesn't have the same properties. And they can see parts of the ultraviolet spectrum that we can't see just with a regular eye. So we're capable of doing it, but it's the lens that prevents us from doing it.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And so it seems hard enough from what I read to find out whether those people actually do see something other than maybe a very bright violet, right? So it's that's where we run into these limits, unless maybe we can come up with more clever techniques than what we have in terms of finding out whether they have color perceptions that we don't have.
Yeah, I mean, so I was going to say that the hard part there then is figuring out what the phenomenology for those people is. But I mean, one possible approach would be to just first see whether they're able to make more discriminations than ordinary people are able to make. And that's, I'm inclined to think, provides some defeasible evidence in favor of thinking that they actually do have more color experiences.
So I had a technical question. So I really like the way that you explained one of your equations was not just with the usual notation, but you had the disks basically showing the different set configurations. And so the thought that popped through my mind there is that I'm also a very visual thinker. And so how much of the formalism that you have depends on and you kind of answered this already, but how much of it depends on the size of the shape? So if it's like a disc-like or ball-like shape, right, then in reality, it may not be, as you said that. And so would the metric still work if it's not that?
Yeah, so basically it doesn't, maybe I should pull up that image just for
So more concretely speaking, when I envision that region, just without further thought, in my mind, it would be something that's more Gaussian than a solid disk, where it seems that even the region itself is not homogeneous, but that the region itself might have like a bell curve kind of shape or something equivalent in 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional space.
Yeah, so let me speak to both things that you were raising. So for the first thing, how much does the way that this metric works rely upon the assumption that the relevant regions are spherical? And the answer is that it doesn't at all. So you don't even need to assume that the regions are disconnected, or sorry, that the regions are connected. So this was designed to work with arbitrary regions of all sorts of weird shapes and sizes. And I mean, when we're thinking about like very weirdly shaped regions, especially disconnected ones, then there's not really clear intuitions anyway about what the right results should be. But what I aim to do in developing this metric was to make sure that it covered, all sorts of weird cases. And that included thinking a lot about what the results would be when we're not assuming uniformity for the shapes or convexity or anything else. So answer to the first question is that this, I think, is going to be fully general. For the second thing, when you were talking about this Gaussian structure, there's a part of my paper that discusses this kind of briefly. So what I say is that one thing you might think is that not only should we move from the standard framework to the regional framework, but we should move even further from the regional framework to a framework where mental qualities are modeled not just by subsets of a space, but also by weighted subsets where each point is assigned some value and where maybe there's more concentration in the middle than the periphery and so forth. So one reason you might be motivated to move to that kind of structure is that if you think that perceptual experiences have probabilistic contents and that probabilistic structure is reflected in the phenomenology, then that might be reason to not give equal weight to all of the different parts of the quality space that the relevant region covers. So maybe there's more concentration in, for example, maybe there's a quality that represents something as having a high probability of being red, but also some low probability of being orange and some low probability of being purple with when all of these like bands of color are of equal size. So anyway, that would be a way of further developing this framework that will involve like more sophisticated structures than just regions. And I think it's super interesting to think about how to develop that further. I mean, there would need to be more sophisticated versions of the similarity metrics I discussed, for example. And I think that would just be a further enriching of our models of quality spaces. One thing that I feel myself agnostic about is just whether we do, in fact, need that additional structure to capture the phenomenology. To me, that's just an open question. I think it's very obvious that there is such a thing as precision when we just think about the contrast between full view experience and peripheral experience. But it's not obvious to me that we need something further. Not that I'm skeptical, but I think it's just more of an open question. But I'm thinking that this is something that might potentially be something I'd like to work on in the future.
This field of qualia structure, mathematical phenomenology, mathematical consciousness science, do you have a feel for where it's headed? If you would have to put money on where things might be in 5 or 10 years, do you have a feel for that there's a direction there?
I mean, I hope that there will be more and more interest in these topics in the near future. And I think that that probably will be the case. One thing I hope will happen, and I think there's a good chance of happening, is for there to be more unity across different disciplines. Right now, it feels like, I mean, this could be said about consciousness research in general too. It feels like there's a lot of different people in different fields that are sometimes developing research that has connections to each other, but are working in different literatures, maybe using different vocabulary or methodologies. So I think there's room for more, I guess, dialogue across disciplines and more, I guess, standardization of terms and ideas and literatures. And I think that that would constitute a form of progress. I guess I also hope that more philosophers become interested in these sorts of topics. It's the structure of consciousness is not really a big topic in the philosophy of mind right now, but I think it has the potential to be. And I think that there's a lot that philosophers can contribute to our inquiry into these subject matters. So I'm hoping that in the field of philosophy specifically, that more attention is paid to these topics in the future.
Maybe related to that, if somebody's watching this and is a young student and interested maybe in this direction, would you have any advice for your younger self? Do you have anything that you could share with somebody like that?
Yeah, well, I guess for students interested in this, I mean, I think consciousness research is a growing field, and that I mean, I bet that this is in the end going to be an exciting time in history to be a part of that field. I think that it's a field that is emerging, where a lot of stuff is happening, where it's only been recently that it's a subject matter that can be seriously studied by scientists. I mean, consciousness used to be solely in the province of philosophers, but now there are people from a variety of disciplines, philosophy, cognosci, neuro, math, even CS, who are focused on consciousness. So yeah, so I think right now the field is fairly disparate and heterogeneous, but I think it's going to probably become more unified over time. And partly because of that, it's a great time to join the field because there's exciting developments happening. I guess maybe it's worth saying that academia is a very tough career to pursue, and that anyone who considers it should keep those sorts of practical considerations in mind too. But I really do think that this is an interesting time in history to be interested and involved in studying consciousness. And I suspect that the structure of consciousness will be a bigger and more developed topic as time goes on.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So I have a few things that maybe I'll edit out, but I really want to hear what you think. And this is one thing, it's a debate I had with Johannes Kleiner also, and you dropped it at some point, whether science has to produce public knowledge.
Whether science has produced what knowledge?
Has to produce public knowledge. So you said that very early on when we talked about whether we might need new math.
Uh-huh.
And so you said that you think that maybe we have to also rethink what science is and what qualifies as science and how science works. And you brought that up, that like one of these points is whether science has to produce public knowledge.
Right.
Yeah, and I find this such an interesting question. And so here's that thought experiment that I thought at some point, and I just want to throw it off. I bounce it off some people. And I want to bounce off you and see what you think. So the thought experiment is that it's like in that movie with Will Smith where the world has ended and he's the only last person alive. I'm Legend, I think, is that movie. And so let's imagine this happened. It's a zombie apocalypse or the rapture, and there's one person left on the planet, and it's the last survivor of mankind. And that person just happens to be a brilliant scientist, somebody like Albert Einstein or Newton.
Yeah.
Then there's no more need for producing public knowledge, right? So there's no more need to express science for others because there's not going to be another human being anymore again. And yet it seems that whatever the scientists would produce would still be totally accepted as science by all of us.
Yeah, that's right. Although one asymmetry there, perhaps with the consciousness case, is that in your scenario, the knowledge produced by the scientists is still in principle communicable and in principle public. If there happened to be like other humans created, then he would be able to communicate his findings to.
And that's people. What I question, right? Because that's where it gets absurd, right? Because like, no, you're really the last survivor. There's not anybody going to come. So there's really no more need to even in principle make it communicable. And yet it still seems that then we would be okay with that. So it really seems that the need for making science public and communicable almost seems more practical than a priori. That's what I'm getting at. It would be very weird to say that if this person is doing science just for themselves, that wouldn't be science anymore, just because it can't be shared. That doesn't seem to be something fundamental about the act of scientific knowledge being shared between two individuals that makes it scientific.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I certainly agree that in the scenario you were sketching, then what the person is doing should count as scientific inquiry and scientific knowledge. It still seems to me that there are some asymmetries between that case and the consciousness case. For example, even though the particular circumstance that the person is in happens to be one where there will never be any communication of the findings, it's still the case that the kind of knowledge that the person is acquiring is the kind that could be communicated to other people. I mean, maybe that's not a relevant asymmetry. So I'm open to thinking that. And I certainly think that there can be first-person investigation of conscious experiences that is scientific in many relevant respects. So I was really thinking of this as a largely verbal question of just like how we define science. I mean, we could, one option would be to think that there's like both first person and third person science. And it just has to be the case that almost all scientific investigation is third person, and that it also, third person investigation produces certain kinds of like benefits like communicability that are less obviously available in the first person case. That seems like a fine way of thinking about things to me. So
because some of your work in a way does also rely on introspection, right? And so so therefore, I mean, it takes first person science in this case kind of serious, and if you do, then some of the issues in consciousness science, they actually kind of fall away, because a lot of them, to me at least, they really come from very, very hard insistence on third person science and public knowledge.
That's right. But part of what I was thinking about earlier is that I think there is a sense in which, suppose we encountered like this alien species that just had different kinds of experiences than us. I'm inclined to think that there's going to be certain things that we know about our own conscious experiences that we're just not going to be able to communicate to them, and vice versa. I think there's a lot that we could communicate to them. For example, structural knowledge about our own experiences. But there might be certain facts about the qualities of our experiences that are just inaccessible to them because of the way that they're built. And you could imagine a scenario where we do, in fact, conduct systematic investigation of those qualities. Maybe we like taxonomize and categorize them and so forth. But I guess one question is just how to think about that kind of inquiry, how to think about how that kind of inquiry relates to normal scientific inquiry as it's normally practiced. And I guess it just seems to me kind of an open question. But I mean, maybe this is another way of putting my view, though. I don't really know how we should think about like the nature of science, but I am confident that phenomenology is a thing that we can do, that we can like make progress in, and that we can investigate systematically in the same way that we investigate other subject matters. And whether that's called science or not, I don't really care, but I'm interested in figuring out how we can advance that mode of inquiry.
That's really beautifully put. Because the next part of my Gedanken experiment would be, let's take life after death, right? And so if you would die and there would be life after death, then in a way, to me, that's an empirical question, or like a scientific question. So you die, and then now you know, there's some kind of life after death kind of thing. It's like nobody would say that this is somehow unscientific that you now have that belief that there's life after death now that has happened to you. Do you see what I'm saying? But it's a single person issue. It's like only you could have that empirical experience. And so that seems to me, again, it's semantics, but it seems to me then if we open consciousness science, that we allow for single person, first person experiences to count, to gain knowledge for each of us on their own, then some of these obstacles might go away. So maybe even, you know, some experiments like Mary's, the famous Mary's room and so on, it seem solvable to me when you drop this hard insistence on, but it has to be third person, has to be communicable. Anyways, I know this is a little out there, but it does pertain to the qualia spaces question a little bit, because it is more introspective than I think the push that psychophysics did, which is that was like the first aim to mathematicize phenomenology, and it really went out of its way to not talk about any first person thing ever. So there was no introspective component. And so it seems to me that some of the breakthrough that has happened, or the progress that's going on, is by softening that requirement a little bit.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that provides a nice way of saying a bit more about my own attitude towards these methodological points. I guess I'm inclined to think that we ought to use a combination of both first person and third person methods in investigating consciousness, and that's what I try to do in my own research. And I mean, I think my work on quality space models is a nice example of that, because the motivation, in my view, for thinking that there is precision in the first place comes from introspection. Just seems very plausible introspectively that foveal color experiences are phenomenologically distinct from peripheral color experiences. But then I think we can also get third-person support from that by looking at differences in discriminatory abilities of people in, say, foveal vision versus peripheral vision, where one of the natural explanations for why there are those differences is because there are differences in the associated experiences. And then we can also apply formal methods and think about how do we capture all of this, mathematically, and then apply those formal methods to, further stages of inquiry. So I tend to be quite holistic in the methodology that I think we should adopt. And I mean, one reason is that, consciousness is just really hard and really difficult to investigate. And we should use whatever tools are available to us. And that's not to presume that any of these tools is like infallible or trumps all of the others. But we can still use a combination to try to figure out whatever we're trying to attain more knowledge of.
Yeah, and I think the success in a way also speaks for itself. If you make progress and there's a success, then you don't have to question the premises even anymore.
I guess one of my main projects right now is on dimensions of consciousness and trying to develop a philosophical analysis of dimensions of consciousness. So that's a term that you sometimes see in the science of consciousness, and you sometimes see what are called multidimensional models of consciousness. There have been some proposals for what the dimensions of consciousness might be, but what nobody has really done yet is develop a systematic analysis of what the relevant meaning of dimensions of consciousness is here. And part of why I became interested in this is that I think there's one natural sense of dimensions of consciousness where it's just obvious that consciousness has an extremely high number of dimensions. So in particular, if you think of dimensions of consciousness as just ways in which conscious experiences vary from each other, then there's going to be innumerably many ways in which conscious experiences can vary from each other. But I think there's also a sense of dimensions of consciousness where it might turn out that consciousness, in this sense, has a low number of dimensions, and where searching for the dimensions of consciousness is going to be an important task for future consciousness research. So one of my projects right now is trying to identify what this more interesting constrained sense of dimensions of consciousness is, and articulating how this has implications for consciousness science.
So how is this related to modalities, or, having smell or vision? Those seem like natural different dimensions that people think of. Is that part of what you're interested in, or is it more about that the idea is that your consciousness could be graded and you could be very conscious or less conscious, so that's one axis?
Yeah, well, I think both of those are related. So one observation is that I think it's fine to call different sensory modalities different dimensions of consciousness. But one thing that we should notice there is that these dimensions are not themselves one-dimensional. So, for example, visual experiences, there's all sorts of different ways in which visual experiences vary. So visual experience itself is going to be very high dimensional. So part of the task here is thinking about what the sense of dimensions of consciousness is that allows us to make sense of these sorts of claims, like different sensory modalities are dimensions of consciousness. You might wonder what justifies the claim that vision is a dimension of consciousness, but not like pink experience. Why doesn't that count as a dimension of consciousness? But you also mentioned this idea about gradability. And I think that that's also connected to thinking about this issue. So, for example, think about global workspace theory. You might have thought that there's an interesting sense in which, say, size of global workspace might be a dimension of consciousness that is different from the sense in which, say, color experience might be a dimension of consciousness. It seems like the first property gets closer to something more fundamental or more at the heart of what consciousness is than the second thing.
I'm fascinated because it seems like a really difficult question to me, because I've always been struck when it comes to personalities. People are at first glance dazzled in the same way as you said, that it seems that it's almost infinite dimensional. Because you said that if you think about different people, the same thing as you said, if you have different experiences, they seem to be so distinguishable from each other. And so that screams many, many dimensions, right? But if you do careful empirical testing, what you find is that all personalities of people can be with, I don't know how many, 90-something% training of the variance can be done in 5 dimensions. And to me, that's always been a very surprising result, that it seems that if you would intuit, you would think that the dimensionality space is much higher for personality. And so
that's right. So if we're trying to capture all differences in personality, we're definitely going to need more than just 5 dimensions. But I guess these, like the ocean model of personality, is intended to abstract away from certain differences while capturing some of the most robust and universal differences in personality that there are. And we could do the same thing for consciousness. We could develop a multidimensional model where we abstract away from certain differences while trying to also identify dimensions that are as universal as possible. I'll mention one more thing, though, that is connected to your mark about gradability, because one of the other things that I'm working on is on degrees of consciousness.
Yeah.
And, so if you spend enough time in the consciousness world, you occasionally hear things like a human is more conscious than a fish, or people become more conscious while on psychedelic drugs. And a lot of philosophers have been skeptical of the coherence of these sorts of claims and have thought that, well, maybe people who are making these claims are just kind of conceptually confused. But my view is that we don't know whether these claims are true or not, but there's nothing semantically defective about these sorts of claims. These claims are still make sense. And so one of my recent publications titled Degrees of Consciousness is arguing that is giving an account of what it means to say that consciousness comes in degrees, and arguing that most theories of consciousness actually entail that consciousness comes in degrees. And that's something that's a publication that came out last year, but I'm also doing some follow-up work right now with Hoppy Mankovitz, a philosopher of language at Bristol, on the semantics of gradable conscious expressions. So, for example, sentences like a human is more conscious than a fish. And our goal is to examine more closely the semantics of these sorts of claims using resources from philosophy of language and linguistics. So that's another project that I'm working on that's directly connected to the gradability stuff.
If I may jump in there really quick. So I saw you presented some of that on Nao Tsuchiya's YouTube channel. And I thought you did something interesting there, which is that you said that consciousness may be graded. And at the same time, the issue that the problem that people often have with that idea is that whether you're conscious or not seems so much of qualitative rather than just a quantitative change. And it's very hard to imagine that. How can you go from zero consciousness to some kind of consciousness? That the moment that you even give it an infinitesimally small kind of consciousness, now you have something else. It's conscious, and in nature that doesn't seem to happen, right? So in nature, you talked about volume and other physical quantities. In the end, they are actually not continuous all the way down. In the end, we know that there's a Planck limit to everything. And there's a discrete jump from something to a certain amount of time, or a certain amount of space, and so on, right? And so it sounded to me like you're granting that for consciousness as well, that you're saying there might be almost like a Planck limit. And then once you go above it, then it's gradable. But that doesn't mean it has to be gradable all the way down. There could be some not discontinuity between no conscious and some consciousness.
Yeah, so that's a nice way of putting it. That's basically the view that I'm most sympathetic to. So one question is whether it can be indeterminate or vague whether an entity is conscious or not, where it has just an intermediate degree of consciousness, meaning it's not yet conscious. It's like on the borderline between not conscious and conscious. And speaking for myself, I'm not sure how to make sense of that. It seems to me like that's conceptually incoherent. But then another question is whether consciousness comes in degrees, meaning some entities are more conscious than others. And it could be the kind of picture that you just articulated, where you get this instant jump from non-conscious to conscious, but once you're in the conscious domain, then some creatures can be more conscious than others.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. In a way, you solved, I think, a sticking point for a lot of people there. It is compatible, it seems to me, with integrated information theory and maybe some other theories as well. So it's really interesting.
Well, it's certainly compatible with IoT. I think it kind of I mean, most people are either very pro or anti-IIT. I'm somebody who's very neutral, I guess. But I think this is one, sometimes IIT has been criticized on the grounds that they appeal to degrees of consciousness. They say that phi values are a measure of how conscious an entity is. And some people have thought that, well, it's not clear that this even makes sense. But my attitude is that it does make sense. It's fine for them to postulate that. It could be that the theory is false, but the mere fact that they're saying that some entities are more conscious than others, that's fine. Because if you really do think that what consciousness is just having a maximal degree of integrated information, then it's natural to think that, if you have more integrated information going on in your system than I do, then you're more conscious than me.
Cool. So, and what else are you working on? You said dimensionality. We got the how do you call it? Grading of consciousness?
Degrees of consciousness.
Degrees of consciousness.
Maybe just one more thing. Well, I am working on something on consciousness and continuity, and whether we should think of our conscious experiences as having continuous or discrete structures. And in particular, whether we have any introspective reason for thinking that they're continuous. So some people have thought that, if you think about your experience of like the blue sky on a cloudless day, there's no gaps in that experience. So that experience must be continuous because there's in some sense no appearance reality distinction in the case of consciousness. And what it is for something to be continuous is just for it to have no gaps. But I think that that's a bit too hasty. I think that introspection just doesn't reveal to us whether our experiences are fundamentally continuous or discrete, that it's more of an empirical question. And basically what that paper is doing is clarifying what it means to say that an experience is continuous or discrete, and providing what a discrete model of those sorts of experiences, like your experience of the blue sky on a cloudless day, might look like, and arguing that we just don't really know at the moment which view is correct.
Do you the more natural way to go there would be time, right? The perception of time, and there's a lot of work on that.
Yeah, well,
does it
it's a little bit tricky there. I think it does translate. I'm thinking about continuity in a general sense, so it could be applied to temporal experience or spatial experience or any domain. And when we're thinking about temporal experience, it's a little bit tricky. We have to distinguish the timing of experience from the experience of time. That's how people would put it sometimes. So there's the objective time that an experience is occurring during, and then there's also what it feels like temporally to have the experience. And it could be that those two things go apart. For example, you could in principle have a view where maybe experiences occur at an instant, but each experience that occurs at an instant feels like it's occurring over some extended period of time. So I'm just concerned with the phenomenology. I'm concerned with, in this case, whether we have any reason to think that temporal phenomenology is continuous as opposed to discrete. Whereas most work that has fallen under the label of consciousness and continuity has been concerned with the timing of experience, so the objective time during which experiences occur. And I think these two issues are related, but they're also conceptually distinct. I guess the other difference is that my concern here is mainly with, do we have any introspective reason for thinking that our experiences are continuous? Because some people have thought that we could just know from introspection that our experiences have these structures. But I think that when we really think about what continuity means and what it would entail for our experiences to be continuous, I mean, that would be kind of incredible if we could just introspect that our experiences have that kind of structure. Instead, I think it's more prudent to think that we just don't know from introspection whether our experiences are continuous or discrete.
This again seems to be like a really important question, because if we're thinking about formalizing the structure of consciousness, that is really important, whether this could all be done with discrete math or whether we have to deal with infinities, right? That makes everything ugly. And it's also maybe related to the people that come from CS, where everything is discrete by definition. And we kind of learned that there's so much you can do with just sticking to the discrete, that maybe there is no need for continuous.
Yeah. Well, sometimes infinities make things ugly. Sometimes they make things easier.
Mm, mm.
But I mean, for example, it's when we're thinking in geometrical or topological contexts, it's much more natural to be working with continuous structures than with discrete structures. But I think this also connects to interesting questions about quality spaces too. So we might wonder whether we should think of them as graphs or as manifolds.
That's
And
right.
I think that's a big question too. That's just kind of open.
Yeah, that's right. But I think what I'm getting at is that, like in pure math, there's this whole debate about, there's the finitists and so on. But in a way, it's funny because when it comes to doing the actual calculations, we typically just apply discrete math, right? So we just round pi to a certain decimal point and so on. And we'll do just fine. We can do a lot of geometry in a computer, even though we can't deal with the infinite. And so so in a way, if we think about that, we want to do something similar with consciousness and structure of consciousness, it might help simplify that we could just break it down and deal with things discretely.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And we should distinguish the question of which kinds of models are most useful and what is the actual structure of the thing we're investigating.
I mean, the original idea of psychophysics is that perception is discrete, right? So the color space actually that Fechner envisioned was that it's very regional actually, right? So that you have these just noticeable differences and then the point of subjective equality. So so actually in the mind of a psychophysicist, it's all like a step function where you go from I can't tell a difference to now I can tell a difference. And so so it really does help. I mean, in that case, when Fechner came along, it helped because it gave rise to the idea that perception can have numerosity. And so for that, you needed that discreteness, that I can count in units of perception by saying it's thresholds. Your just noticeable differences go from 1 to 2 and so on. And so, so it seems a really interesting, important question. At the same time, intuitively, as you said, that's really hard to wrap your head around because it seems that, of course, everything seems continuous.
So I guess I think that once we think carefully about it, it doesn't, I mean, I do think we don't notice gaps in our experiences. That's definitely right.
Right.
But then whether we should infer from that our experiences seem continuous to us in the mathematical sense of continuity, that's the point that I want to resist. And I think that for all we know, even though it is the case that our experiences aren't gappy, they could still be discrete.
Now, the empirical examples of gappy experiences like the blind spot and all of this, there you have filling in. And so in a way, that would be interpolation. And you could still argue it's a continuous space, right? So you have a gap, and it just gets interpolated. Right.
Yeah.
So, but you're going further and you're saying, no, it could be fundamentally pixelized, basically. And you would still, that's interesting.
I mean, one way to put the general thought is that to notice a gap, you have to notice the things that would fill in the gap.
Right.
But then, of course, we're not experiencing the things that would fill in the gap because that would mean that our experience is different than it actually is.
It's also, as a neuroscientist, this is such an interesting thing, actually, because neurons, in a way, are discrete, right? So they fire action potentials. And so if we think that it's action potentials that are causing perception, it's very hard to think that would be a really continuous thing because it is discretized at that level of information or whatever we want to call it, right? So when it comes to color perception, that's what I'm thinking about explicitly, then I think, again, we get fooled because we're dealing with light as a starting point, and that is continuous, the waveforms there. But our color perception, the way that I teach about it, is that we think of the 3 photoreceptors and how much they get activated. And that's discrete. That is in how many action potentials they fire. So that space, the color space that I teach, is a discrete space. It can't be continuous because it has basically three vectors that have discretized activations.
Yeah. So then another angle from which to think about this question is that if we did think that introspection reveals that our experiences are continuous, then you might think that places substantive constraints on what the physical correlates of our experiences might be and rules out some of the most prominent possibilities for thinking about those physical correlates. But then that seems, that would be a pretty substantive implication. But I guess I think that we shouldn't rule out those.
You're still agnostic
possibilities. Yeah.
That's interesting. Okay, cool. Real brief, maybe you said there's a 4th one you're working on?
Sure. Maybe I'll just briefly mention So one thing I'm working on outside of the structure of experience is I have various kinds of work on the ethics of consciousness. I'm interested in understanding generally how consciousness is ethically significant, both with respect to our own welfare and with respect to morality. And one of my new papers is called Consciousness Makes Things Matter, where I argue basically that consciousness is what makes an entity the kind of thing that can be doing well or badly. And I think relatedly is the basis for moral status. Mm-hmm. So that's a view that I think many people feel intuitively compelled by, but which hasn't actually received any sustained defense in the philosophical literature. So that's one new thing that I'm working on in the ethics of consciousness. And just one example of, like, I guess, a bit of my work outside of the structure of consciousness.
Oh, wow. You really have a knack for really interesting things. I mean, this is one where you really got me, because I'm very skeptical of attributing functions to consciousness. And yet, as you said, that is very intuitive. that is very compelling argument. Yeah, it's relevant too, right? As AI is marching along.
There's been so much discussion, like, in the last few months about that sort of stuff in the context of AI.
Yeah.
And usually the people are just implicitly assuming that consciousness is the basis for welfare and for moral status. And I mean, as I said, I endorse those intuitions, but I think it's also interesting thinking about what the most careful philosophical defense of that view is.
Interesting. Very interesting. Wow. Yeah. So that was a lot. That was very cool. So I hope we can repeat this at some point. This is really exciting. So thank you so much again, Andrew. That was really cool. And do you have any parting thoughts or ideas?
No, I mean, I'm looking forward to, where your channel is going. And yeah, I mean, thanks a lot for bringing me on. I really enjoyed the conversation. And you've also inspired me to, maybe try to create my own YouTube channel, as I was saying at the beginning. Perfect. But yeah, I'm looking forward to what you do in the future with the channel. And I think there will be, as I said, it's an exciting time to be part of this field.
Yeah, perfect. And everything, your website and everything else will be in the description below for people to find. So thanks so much.
Thank you.